Welcome to our program today. My name is Mel Lehman. I'm the director of a nonprofit group called Common Humanity. And what we try to do is bring people together and build peace by building understanding. And my studio shows the two parts of my life that I've tried to bring together, and I try to share that synthesis with people we work with Common Humanity. Behind me is an Amish Mennonite quilt, which is part of my American heritage. And also behind me are some paintings from the Middle East. Common Humanity works with showing artists, and in this pandemic time, we have a lot of our work online. We'll talk about that a little bit later if we can get a few minutes at the end of Mr. Ingemanson's presentation. Well, enough about me and our work. Let's meet our guest. Our guest today is Mats Ingemanson. Welcome, Mats. It's good to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
As we said, setting up, if I was to read this whole bio, we wouldn't have time left for the presentation. But a couple of highlights that struck me. Mats grew up in Sweden, and as we said a little bit ago, as we were coming on air, Mats is an immigrant, and Mats is living proof that immigration is good for this country. Right here is a man who's made a great contribution. He came to America and went to Berkeley, California, and owned a computer business in the infant computer industry and worked with many of its pioneers, including Bill Gates, quite a distinguished group of friends. He has worked in international business before his current job. He has worked around the world. And he is, in recent years, he has become the chair and founding member of Rotary Grassroots Peacemaking since 2014. One of the largest, if not the largest, peacemaking organization in the world. So we have a lot to talk about, and I would note from the outset that we're looking for questions. We have plenty prepared to share with you, but we both would really love to have some questions. So let's get started, and we're going to be looking to spice up the conversation with some input from people. So I see two questions already. We'll get to them in a moment. But welcome, Mats, and glad to have you with us.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Shall we start with some slides?
Yeah, let's do that. The first slide has a very provocative statement. You have it there, or share screen, or? Oh, there we are.
There we are.
And, oh, there. I claim that everybody wins with peace, everybody loses with war. And of course, some people, I've heard people say, well, what about the military industry? Don't they win with war? And so on. And I claim that that's not fully correct. So, but let me go down further on the slides, and we'll do wars. Wars used to be win-lose games if we go back in history. And our history books teaches us that the glorious leaders were those who were winners of war. But the reality is that that's no longer the case. Nowadays, wars, there are no winners in wars. Wars have become a game where everybody loses. Next slide. So here, for example, if we take America, we have been involved in a couple of wars here. In Syria, we spent $15.3 billion. In Afghanistan, we spent $975 billion. In Iraq, $1.7 trillion. In Middle East and Asia, $5.9 trillion. And in addition to that, we have $490 billion in additional cost and benefits owed to war veterans, and expenses that could grow to $6 trillion over the next decades. And more than 480,000 people have died, and another 10 million people have been displaced. Now, what have we gained by spending all this money? Has the world gotten any better since we started these wars? And I would say that it hasn't. The situation in Syria hasn't gotten any better. In fact, you could say that it has gotten worse. The situation in Afghanistan, you could argue that it has gotten worse. And the situation in Iraq at least hasn't gotten any better. And in the Middle East, so on. So therefore, we can't show any tangible benefit from having spent all this money. And of course, people, even the toughest business person would argue that why are we spending all this money if we don't have any benefit of doing it?
And at this moment, we are in the middle of a pandemic, and we are seeing some really terrible things happening to people losing their jobs. So since these numbers have been compiled, any comments about the current people talking about now another depression? So we have so many people in need, and we're spending all this money on war, and we could be making much better use of it by spending people who are losing their jobs and needing health care and so forth.
Well, actually, one positive aspect of the pandemic is that there are probably less war activities going on right now because people are too afraid to be out there fighting each other, so they stay home. But the reality is that I tend to look at the world as intellectual resources, and so education, for example, is an investment in intellectual resources, and I'm getting to that more in my presentation, that we are better off if we spend money, you invest this money into education and training and so on, and building prosperity, and that's the whole point. For example, peacemaking in the front end only cost 1% of war in the back end. And there are a lot of things, if we go back to these conflict zones, we could have had much better effect if we had chosen a peacemaking approach rather than a war approach. And actually, people at the grassroots level overwhelmingly want peace because they are the ones that suffer from it, and these are the overwhelming majority of people in the world. So, but the only possibility for peace is that everybody wins. You can't have a peace where one party wins and the other party loses, because the losing party will always seek revenge, and that's when the war keeps on going back and forth. So we have a grassroots peacemaking 4-step method, which can be used to negotiate peace. The conflicting party agrees to the following steps. One, they agree to the philosophy, and our philosophy is that everybody wins with peace, everybody loses with war. Now, if you don't believe that, then you won't be. Then there's no point in having negotiations, because if one party believes that they can win with war, then obviously the other party has to defend themselves. I'm not anti-military, by the way. I believe in a strong defense, and I believe that we need a strong defense to police the peace. My problem is mainly how our military has been used, and because it hasn't really been in support of peace in many cases. But in general, I'm very supportive of a strong military. But in order to, if we can agree on the philosophy, then the next step is to agree on a vision. I see this slide here has 2 number 1s, but the other number 1 should be number 2, and then 3 and 4. So step 2 would be to develop a win-win vision about the prosperity for all. So that if the warring parties can say, okay, if we could make peace with each other, this is how we would benefit from it. We could have business with each other. We could develop our economies and our prosperity. And you know, you don't have to love each other, or you don't even have to like each other, but it's in your self-interest that you want to take care of each side, want to take care of its own society. And then once you develop that vision, then you develop a mission on how to detailedly implement that vision. And once you develop that, then you take action where you implement the agreed mission. And this, if you follow these 4 steps, the parties can stay on the same page. Now, the problem, for example, in conflicts is that they are lacking the philosophy, they're lacking a common vision, and they have, each party has its own mission and takes its own action. For example, in the Middle East, a Palestinian suicide bomber kills an Israeli mother of 6 children, and the Israelis retaliate by sending in F-16s and bomb people and kills another 50 people. And then the retaliation goes back like a ping pong game, and it doesn't lead to peace.
Let's see if we can get any Q&A, if my system works here. There's our, let's try some great pictures here and tell us about these people here.
Well, it's well known that North and South Korea is a big conflict zone, maybe the worst in the world. And the interesting thing is that both North and South Korea have embraced the 4-step method now for grassroots peacemaking. And here is an example where Sandra and I, my wife Sandra and I, we met with the ambassador of North Korea, and I showed him this write-up about grassroots peacemaking 4-step method. He studied it very carefully, and he asked if he could keep it, which of course he could. So that's, and actually North and South Korea in their negotiations are using this 4-step method now.
Oh, very good.
And here you can see other pictures of with diplomats from North Korea on one side and diplomats from South Korea on the other side. So if you look at the conflict there, you will notice that there haven't been any detonations of nuclear bombs in a couple of years, and there hasn't been any killing across the borders in a couple of years. I'm not saying that they're ready to open the borders and welcome each other in peace and brotherhood yet, but we're making steps forward. It's gradual steps.
And there we see next to you, let's identify the people in the picture there. The gentleman next to you was a previous guest here on the Peace Channel. His name was Doug Hostetter, and he was speaking about his work in North Korea. And there behind you are the two, is the father and grandfather of the current leader of North Korea, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. This photo was taken at the North Korean embassy, and where Doug actually introduced Sandra and me to their ambassador for NGOs, Ri Yong-Phil. So we had a meeting with them.
And what were some of the things that your impressions were when you were with the North Koreans? What kind of sense did you have of them?
Well, North Korea, it's actually, we have had a lot of contacts with North Koreans, not only at the embassy, but we also have North Koreans that have very high, have relationships in Pyongyang with up to the top level there. Mm-hmm. And we have been told that North Korea want to have a very good relationship with USA and South Korea, and they so they would like that, but they're also very suspicious about aggression from our side, and the reason of that is that they would like to sign a peace treaty, and of course, what is it? 65 years or whatever, since 1953, when the hostilities ended, there is still technically a war going on between North Korea and the USA and South Korea. So we they take that literally, and the refusal on our side to sign a peace treaty, they consider that to be an act of war. So my recommendation has been that America should sign a peace treaty, and then the relationship would be more relaxed, I believe.
One of the things we learned in our previous discussions about North Korea a couple of programs ago, that I think that most Americans, including myself, were just hardly aware of, is that the North Koreans still remember just the pulverizing bombing during the Korean War. And the bombing was so severe. One of the people on our program, an artist, described it to me as the American planes coming over like a plague of locusts. And the bombs that were dropped just pulverized hardly a building standing. And that memory, which we hardly are aware of, but that memory still lingers in North Korea, and it's something we have to somehow find a way to move beyond. But that's I think that's part of what's in their mind. How would you comment on that?
Well, I have a different point of view about that, actually. They of course remember the bombing, but they have never lambasted us for it. In fact, I think the North Koreans tend to see that as that America is a very strong nation, and of course in the Oriental culture you're impressed with those who are strong, and the nature of America is that we can be very, very generous, of course, like look at the Marshall Plans, as if we are a friend. But if we're an enemy, we can be very dangerous as an enemy because we can obliterate a country. But if you look at North Korea, they are actually seeking our friendship. And you can look at Vietnam, for example, who has been bombed a lot. And they are now our allies. Mm-hmm. Because historically they have always viewed China as being their main enemy, and they're actually seeking America's protection against China, for example. So they are not really pointing. They're not. I mean, I think it's not so much bitterness on their part. I think it's more a respect that they see that we are a very strong nation and we could be a very strong ally.
Let's see if we can get some questions in here. We have one of your fellow Rotarians working for peace says, "Thank you for a great dialogue. So keep those questions coming." We have, Matt's is very eager to take your questions. And what about this point that war, I've once heard the American military as a bipartisan jobs program, that we have Democrats and Republicans afraid to vote against it because they'll be labeled as soft on the military, and at the same time they get the benefits of here's a new, airplane manufacturing that's going to be built in your states. So there's going to be jobs. What would you say about those things? How do we counter that point when we're talking with people?
Well, I mean, those factories that are in those states, and of course, probably every congressman would like to have a military industry in their districts. But the reality is that military production can also be converted into civilian production. And America has a long tradition of converting in the First World War and before the Second World War. We typically converted our civilian industry into military industry when necessary. And then afterwards, we converted it back into civilian industry. And it wasn't until after the Second World War when we decided to have a permanent military industry. And President Eisenhower, in his last farewell speech before he left power, he warned us of having the dangers of having a permanent military industry that could take over and become over empowering. But there are for example, look at Japan and Germany. They had a strong military industries, and after the Second World War, they were not able to convert their, they were not allowed to have strong military industries anymore. And they converted their military industry into civilian production. And they benefited greatly from that. And Japanese and German products are well known around the world for their quality and so on. And that helped to build up the prosperity of these two countries, because they didn't have to spend much money on their military.
Let's take another slide. We have another question coming in, but let's take another slide here, and some great people you've been working with here.
Well, this slide is just an introduction to next slides, but the point is that many world leaders are supporting now grassroots peacemaking. We have the General Secretary of the United Nations, Gutierrez, and we have the former Secretary, Ban Ki-moon, the Pope with his UN representative, and we had the Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran. We had their ambassador at a conference with us, and I also had a conversation with a French philosopher, Henri. So there's more and more people are coming to the conclusion that peace is much more beneficial for everybody than war.
Here you are with UN Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez.
Yeah, and the former General Secretary Ban Ki-moon, and in one picture there, I gave a speech at the United Nations. And the next picture was the Nobel Prize laureate Oscar Arias Sanchez. And it's not surprising that they are very much supportive of peace, of course.
Yeah. Well, here's a very interesting question just came in from Shab, one of your fellow Rotarians.
Okay.
He writes, maybe the physical wars are slowing down. What about the cyber and technology wars? Now, your background, you've had a distinguished background with distinguished people in computers. You would be a good person to answer that. What about that question? We read about computer sabotaging and so forth.
Well, obviously, cyber wars, you don't shoot each other and kill each other, but cyber warfare can result in violence, demonstrations that result in violence. So that can be dangerous also. But I think whenever you introduce a new technology, you always have unintended consequences. For example, when the book printing method was introduced in was it the 1500s or something like that?
Right.
There were unintended consequences because people now could suddenly start printing and spreading misinformation. And that we may not think of that, but the 30-year war in Europe started because of misinformation that was spread, and suddenly, and when we look at, for example, the radio, when it became widely used, that was very helpful for Adolf Hitler, for example, to get his message out, or Mussolini. So I think without the radio, I think Hitler would still have been a local politician in Munich. But of course, it was very helpful for Franklin D. Roosevelt to get his message out, and for Winston Churchill. So it works both ways.
Right.
And then, of course, then we instituted checks and balances of what you were allowed to say on the radio, because the FDC had they have regulations on what you can say on the radio. You can't just preach hate speech on the radio any way you want. So and the same thing with TV. So now when we have the social media and the internet, we don't have those restrictions. So people can actually basically say all kinds of lies, that they kill children in a pizzeria and eat them or whatever, completely untrue.
Yeah.
And I think we need to have some kind of restrictions on what we say, because some people take these statements for face value, that they may think that those are true. And I think there's time for the government to, on a bipartisan basis, go in and set certain standards on what is true and what is absolutely false.
We have another question from George. He has a kind of reality check that, if I see his question correctly, that the United Nations has been playing a dominant role in working for peace, but we haven't achieved as much as we would want. Could you give some examples to help us better understand that? Some examples of peace that has been achieved through the United Nations work. We all can cite examples of wars that continue. What about some wars that have been averted or ended through UN interventions?
Well, the United Nations is not a perfect organization, of course, and it's not the world government either. I see it as a condominium where you have 193 states being owners of it. They be shareholders. And the whole point of the benefit of the United Nations is that if we take the UN building in New York, it's international territory, and every sovereign state can be a member of that if they are. So America doesn't have a veto on that. So let's say, well, they may have, but so for example, we have Iran, who's a member of the United Nations, and we have North Korea as a member of the United Nations, but we do not have diplomatic relationships with them. But here in the United Nations, you can have diplomats from enemy countries sit down together over a cup of coffee in a cafeteria and discuss things and avoid having wars. But of course, when wars are avoided, we never hear of it. It's only when wars happen that we hear of it. And then, of course, the Security Council gets involved and have been able to had a positive influence on that. So I would say that not being perfect, I think the United Nations have avoided many conflicts in the past. And of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis was an example of how the United Nations played an important role.
I think that's a very important point that you just said. I haven't quite thought of it that way, but that's going to stick with me. There's a grim but famous, and I think very to the point saying, in newsrooms, if it bleeds, it leads. That is to say, the lead story is images of fighting and images of the latest war somewhere. And we don't see the images of peacemaking. So I think you make a very, very good point. We don't hear about the peace that has been made and the peace that is made through all of the other aspects of the United Nations, the health care, the great help that's being provided right now through sharing of information through the United Nations auspices, the World Health Organization, feeding of children, the refugee office, which I've had numerous contacts with. So yeah, I think that we see failures, but it's harder to see the good parts that are happening.
Pope John Paul II, he was in Poland and he was followed by a journalist. And the journalist asked him if the Holy Father minded that he could follow him. And the Pope said, well, if you don't write about it, it never happened, you know.
Right.
So he understood the value of publicity. Of course, peacemaking is more effective if it's done out of the limelight. I don't believe in negotiation by Twitter, for example. I think it's more important to do things quietly, because people then don't have to take postures and lose face if anything is. But you know, you have situations where diplomats can be friends, be personal friends, even if their countries are enemies. Right. For example, Zhou Enlai and Henry Kissinger were personal friends and developed a very good personal relationship, but their countries, of course, were mortal enemies. And so, but that's a good way of developing personal relationship between diplomats.
Which is what you do. Let's take another slide here.
Yeah.
These are some American political leaders you've gotten to know, and tell us a bit about how they've reacted to your views of peace. Have you gotten them on board with your 4-point plan?
Well, I met Nancy, Sandra and I, we met Nancy Pelosi at a party, and I had an opportunity to sit down and talk to her about the situation in North Korea. And she, to my surprise, she told me that she had been in Pyongyang, and she actually had seemed to have a sincere interest in the relationship with North Korea. So I thought that was very interesting. And so obviously she's supportive of peace rather than war. The Elijah Cummings, who unfortunately has passed away, we met him at another party, so I had a very good conversation with him also. Here is a very interesting. Most people probably think of Iran as a very hostile and a dangerous enemy. And oddly enough, not surprising to me, but oddly enough, their diplomats have been at 2 of our meetings speaking to our group of Rotarians. We had in 2016 the ambassador to the UN, Koshro, and now this year in May we had the new ambassador Ravanchi speaking. Ravanchi was also the assistant to the Iranian Ministry of Foreign Affairs when they negotiated the nuclear deal with America and John Kerry. So, and he agreed to come and present his point of views. That meeting is posted on YouTube. You can search, you can find it if you search my name, Mats Ingemanson. And we were very surprised when he spoke, because this was not long after America had killed one of their top militaries. And you could expect that maybe they would leash out and accuse America for all kinds of things. But that's not what he said. He basically said that the what do you call it, the sanctions were damaging for them to provide medical care for people who suffer from the pandemic. And he actually would like to have a better relationship with America. And he also said clearly, when I asked him, does Iran really want to have nuclear weapons? And he said, no, absolutely not. We don't. So, I mean, and obviously they would like to live with countries around them in peace.
If I could put in a plug for Common Humanity, we had also on the Common Humanity Peace Channel about 2 months ago, we had another Iranian scholar, Nabi Sanboli, and he basically gave the same message, that we have to try to understand each other better. And his tone, his whole approach was very both scholarly, but also very humane and very conciliatory. So if you go to YouTube, click on YouTube after the meeting and sometime, and go to Common Humanity Peace Channel, you'll see 2 interviews that we had with also a gentleman, Nabi Sanboli, a scholar related to the UN Iranian office. Another question here.
Yeah, I have before you do that, I have another comment here.
Yeah.
I have been, you know, people have told me that, you know, these diplomats, they're very friendly and diplomatic and all of that, but don't be swayed by that, because they're maybe not as nice guys as you think they are. But the reality is that I understand that countries act in their self-interest. I have no illusions about that. But the reality is that peace is in their self-interest, because they benefit from peace. They have no benefit from having their people killed and their buildings destroyed. So I'm actually saying that peace is in their self-interest.
So why do we have wars if your point is so transparently clear? It's so to the heart and to the head, and it makes absolute sense. So my question is, why do we still have wars?
Well, uh, it's a very simple human psychology, actually. If I'm in a meeting, let's say with a group of people, and I come up with a new idea, people have a resistance to change. And so I found if I'm in a meeting and I suggest something, they usually are very reserved about it. But then maybe 2 or 3 years later, they come up with this idea and they think it's their idea. And now they forgot that I mentioned it. But that's fine, as long as it and I think that's what it is. We're planting seeds here.
Yeah.
And it's going to take time for people to really fully change, because people don't like change, really. So this is an ongoing
Yes,
mission.
I found at this point in my life, with each succeeding year, I am less willing to change. So I think the older I get, the more stuck in my ways I am. I'll admit that. So
I wasn't meant as I mean, you may. I'm sure you're so much grounded in peace thinking anyway. So so you have no need to change.
oh well, that's another topic. Let's move to another slide.
What was that question you were going to ask?
Oh, the question, right. I'm sorry. The question is, what elements should be present or absent in order for peace to occur? There's a good question.
Well, if the two parties realize that it's in their self-interest to have peace, and they don't have to like each other, they can even hate each other, that's okay, love can come later. But if they come to the conclusion that it is in their self-interest to have peace, then I think they will act in their own self-interest, and they will find a way to work together.
Mm-hmm.
And every situation is different. So that's why I'm focusing on the vision and philosophy and vision. And the philosophy is that it is in your self-interest to have peace. And that's my main mission, to convince people of their self-interest in this regard.
So how have you done when it comes to Palestine, Israel? What's your track record there?
Well, I have. I'm a friend of the Palestinian ambassador. I haven't been able to meet the Israeli ambassador, but I met many Israelis, and it is clear that both sides want peace. And there's some very interesting. There's a lot of stuff going on between Israel and Palestine. For example, I was told that the Israeli Mossad are working together with the Palestinian Secret Service on protecting the Palestinian president Abbas from being killed by his enemies. So it's like a bad marriage, the relationship is there, they can't live with each other and they can't live without each other. And I think that's what's going on. And then, of course, when you try to find solutions, they both are very remember all the nasty things that happened to them in the past. But the reality is you have to forego that and look forward of what benefits you can have for the future. But then they also have, both sides have a tendency to play four-dimensional chess. And I think it's very tempting to get involved with that, but I have decided not to get involved in four-dimensional chess. And I just want to focus on that everybody in Israel and Palestine would win by having peace. They could share the prosperity, and they could benefit from working together. And of course, Palestinians and Israelis in America work very well together. But once they're back there, they don't. So there's something with the infrastructure that doesn't seem to work.
Well, if I could put myself in the place of a Palestinian, the obvious things they're hearing are talks of annexation, and the famous image of the shrinking map of Palestine, if you see what it was like in 1910, 1917, and then 4 maps to the present, it keeps shrinking and shrinking. And now there's talk of annexation and the building of settlements. If we were to put ourselves in the place of the Palestinians, what might you say to that?
Well, I don't find that very attractive. But to tell you the truth, one of the problems they have here is that Israel is guided by extremists, because Netanyahu is on a very brittle coalition where the extremists can tip the scale. If they leave the coalition, he would lose power. And Abbas is influenced by this with extremists on the other side. The position of the extremists on the Israeli side is that they should annex all of the West Bank, and they should send all the Palestinians to Jordan or wherever, they should leave. And of course, the extremist on the Palestinian side is that they should throw all the Israelis into the sea. So how can you compromise between these two positions? It's completely unrealistic. Either one of these positions are unrealistic. You can't ignore people on either side. So there's no way, nobody's going to win with those positions. So they're going to have to find a way of living together, working together, and they could make money together, live in prosperity. And again, they don't have to like each other, but I don't see any other alternative. They just have to come to that conclusion. And it may take another 1,000 years and more people may be killed, or they can decide on it in a few years and fewer people will be killed. Those are the only choices that I see.
Here you are meeting with some distinguished Israelis and friends of Israel. Was that a good characterization of these slides?
Yeah, the Israeli journalist Benny Avni is well known in Israel, and he's also written in American publications. And he was the one that told us about the situation, the cooperation between Mossad and the Palestinian and a security service. And of course, the French philosopher Bernard Henri Lévy he's a French, a Jewish Frenchman, but he's also very strongly supportive of Israel. And Rabbi Yaakov Cohen, who is from Crown Heights in Brooklyn, he is a follower of Rabbi Schneerson, and he's a personal friend, and he has his opinions about what should be done. He feels that Israel should be in its benevolence should be doing what's best for Israelis and the Palestinians. I personally don't think that's a realistic point of view. I think Palestinians need to decide on their own future and Israelis on their own future. But, I think it's a matter of respect also and dignity.
Yeah. And what a great sculpture that is. I've seen that many times. And maybe we could have that as the logo for Grassroots Peacemaking.
Well, that sculpture is actually created by a Swedish artist.
There you go.
Called Fredrik Reuterswärd.
There you go. And
it is in, I think, in 7 different places around the world.
What a great, tell us about some of these very interesting places.
Well, Serbia, Kosovo is another crisis area. And we visited the Rotary Club in Belgrade, and they had looked us up on Google, and they found a lot of information about peacemaking, and they asked me if I could help them with the relationship with Kosovo. That's in the picture to the right, and of course, we happen to know the General Consul Tiuta from Kosovo in New York. She is also a member of Rotary. So we had meetings with her, and we heard their side, or the Kosovo side of the thing, and we heard the Serbian side of things through the Rotary Club of Belgrade. And the reality is that there's a lot of bitterness between Serbia and Kosovo, but I believe that they have come to the conclusion that there is no benefit for them to fight each other or kill each other. So I think a little bit of time has to pass before they can truly be friends, you know.
Some of the questions we're getting, I believe, are from your great organization, which is spread out around the world. Could you tell us a little bit about what some of your members are doing? What kinds of things? You're based there on the upper echelons of the United Nations Diplomatic Corps. What's some of the good grassroots work that's being done around the world for peacemaking?
Well, Rotary consists of about 1.2 million members in 210 countries and territories. And we biggest project we have done is the eradication of polio. For example, we decided in 1978 that we wanted to eradicate polio, and 300,000 people, I think, died from polio every year, or had, no, they didn't die, but they had polio, but many people died. And we decided to start vaccinating children. It started in the Philippines, and 10 years later, we raised $260 million to put it on a real big platform. And now we got many other organizations involved, the United Nations, Bill and Melinda Gates. We got the U.S. Congress, who doesn't seem to agree on anything. Rotary convinced them to contribute $3.5 billion. And Rotary has raised, I think, 1.6 billion, Bill and Melinda 2.5 billion, and total maybe 18 billion altogether. And now we have eradicated more than 99.9% of all the polio cases. And even, I think there 50 or 60 cases left now in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And many of them is because we have difficulty getting to all the tribes because some of them it's simply not safe. But in reality now, millions of people today live polio-free. They would not have lived polio-free if we didn't start that up. And we're talking about the pandemic of today. I mean, those of us who were alive in the 50s, I'm sure we remember the pandemic of polio and what kind of danger that was to us, you know.
Yeah. John asks, are you working with any of the Rotary Peace Scholars?
Well, the Peace Scholar program was started by a friend of mine. He's passed away now, but his name was Eddie Blender. And he and I was also founding member of Rotary Global History Fellowship. And the idea or the philosophy of the Peace Scholars is that we will educate a group of young people from around the world to get a master's degree in peace administration, and then to send them into different government positions. They will seek jobs in different government administrations and the United Nations, and that way have an influence in a peaceful direction. So that's a very successful program. And again, we educate, let me see, 24 graduates, and it's a fully paid program and every year, and so it's going to grow every year.
And where would people find more information about that?
You can actually Google that. You could do Rotary. You could just Google a Rotary Peace Scholarship, and you will find how to apply for it. And then you get a local Rotary club to sponsor you, and there are plenty of them. There are 36,000 Rotary clubs around the world.
Excellent. I'm very impressed. This is wonderful. I think we need to hear more about the Rotary. We got to continue this. We're getting towards the end of our hour, and we do want to end within the hour. So we're pushing towards the end. We have a few more images. This is Taiwan.
Yeah, Taiwan is we actually, I can tell you one thing. We had one of our presidents of Rotary International was from Taiwan, and And he came to New York, and I wanted to introduce him to the Taiwanese representatives. They're not technically an embassy, but they're trade office. But they treat it as an embassy themselves. And I found them to be very. If you can go back to that slide, I found them to be very. That's the ambassador, and here's the second in command. They're both friends of ours. But what I found was that they gave a speech back in 2015. And I said, what is your real relationship with China? And it turns out that even though Taiwan and China are technically at war with each other, they had 700 non-stop planes flying between Taiwan and China. And many of Taiwan was the third biggest investor in China, and many of the Chinese businesses were owned and operated by Taiwanese businessmen. And they also had 1 million Chinese tourists coming to Taiwan. But the interesting thing is that China views Taiwan as a province of China. So if you're a Taiwanese businessman, you can travel to China and you will immediately get Chinese passport, Chinese ID papers, and you'll be treated like a Chinese citizen. And so they take advantage of that. But then they told us that the diplomats told us that there was a movement in Taiwan to declare independence. And for those of you who don't know, but the official policy was that they considered themselves to be the legitimate government of China at some point under Chiang Kai-shek. But if they declare independence, then they would say we have nothing to do with China. And Mao used to say that Chiang and Mao used to agree on one thing, and that is that it should be one China. And the Chinese are accepting that. They can have different independence, but they should pursue that there should be one China. So I said to them, you already have independence, but if you declare independence, then the Chinese will be upset, and they will be bad for the relationship. So they came back to me a month later and said that we have a new policy. We have a policy of status quo. We don't declare independence, and we don't pursue reunification. And 2 months after that, the presidents of Taiwan and the president of China met in Singapore. And from that meeting, and that's the only time they ever met, they issued a joint statement to pursue the relationship based on status quo. And that happened with us in New York. And that's got started there.
Yeah, we have to push through. I do want to end in an hour for respectful of people's schedules. Let's say a brief word about this, and then I think we're near the end of our hour.
Yeah, well, Rotary International is, of course, is the biggest peacemaking organization in the world. And here is the General Secretary of Rotary International, John Yuko, who is a personal friend of Sandra and me. And the president of, past president of Rotary International, Ravi Ravindran, is from Sri Lanka, and he's been involved in negotiations between the Tamil Tigers and the Sri Lankan government. And here is Gary Huang, who is from Taiwan and travels often to China and opening up Rotary clubs in China. And there we have the past Rotary International President Louis Giai and the past Vice President Celia Giai. They married, and they're from Argentina, and they've been involved in peace negotiations between Chile and Argentina, and also in Cyprus. And then our grassroots peacemaking, we've had meetings in face-to-face. Now we have them online. We met across the street from the UN, but we have 4,556 members in 100 countries around the world. Where our mission is to create a more peaceful world through grassroots peacemaking. And we're getting more and more people. I think we got 1,000 new members in the last year alone.
And a very special thanks to all of the members of Grassroots who have joined us today. And this lovely lady is?
This is my wife Sandra, and this is the lake outside our house. And it could be a symbol for how nice it could be to live in peace, you know.
A very good message to end on. There we are. Thank you so much. If I could take one last minute before our hour is up, I'd like to say just a word about common humanity. And let's try this screen share again.
Okay.
Common humanity works very similarly to what Grassroots does. So we're a good link to have. We are working with Middle East artists to build understanding, so much misunderstanding between people in the US and people in the Middle East. And we found that art is a good way to do that. For the past decade, we've had art exhibits in churches and other civic buildings, academic places with Iraqi refugee artists. Now that we can't have exhibits, we've taken our exhibit online. If you go to commonhumanity.org, commonhumanity.org, you'll see these beautiful images. And let me just scroll through these. These are posters, and you can buy these. They are $20 a piece, and $10 goes directly to the artist. Imagine yourself a refugee artist. You had trouble getting into a gallery. The galleries are closed at the moment. What are you going to do? So we're doing what we can to help support, get some funding and some visibility for these wonderful artists. So go to our website, commonhumanity.org, and there's a famous artifact from thousands of years ago. It's in the Iraq Museum. So many wonderful paintings here. Some of these artists are now in the United States, resettled, and some of them are in Canada, and you can learn much more about this again by going to commonhumanity.org. Thank you, Mats, for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. Any concluding words that you would like to leave us with? Any final words?
Thank you, Mel, for inviting me. And I enjoy your meetings that you have on Saturdays when you interview different artists to promote peace. So that's something I personally enjoy very much, and I'm very, very honored to be part of this program and to talk about. Usually I interview people, but this is an opportunity for me to talk about what the grassroots peacemaking is.
Well, you're a very gifted interviewee. It's great to chat with you. I enjoyed it so much, and we must have you back again before too long. Thank you. The Peace Channel is going to be back in a couple of weeks again. You can find out our resumed schedule after a brief summer break, commonhumanity.org. Thank you, Mats. Have a wonderful weekend. Great to see you with us. Thanks for being our guest.
Thank you, Mel.
Great program.
Thank you. Bye-bye.